Ambassador Daniel Wright looked out the viewport of his shuttle as it approached the massive ring structure of the Galactic Concord Station. After 15 years as humanity's senior diplomat, he still felt a sense of wonder each time he saw the gleaming silver ring against the backdrop of stars. The station represented everything he had worked for: cooperation, understanding, and peace among the 17 known intelligent species. The shuttle docked with a gentle bump. Daniel straightened his navy blue diplomatic uniform and ran a hand through his graying hair. At 48, the stress of representing Earth and its colonies had left its mark on his face, but his blue eyes remained sharp and observant. "We've arrived on time, Ambassador," said the pilot. "Your meeting starts in 30 minutes. Daniel nodded and gathered his data tablets. The urgent summons had come just 12 hours ago, interrupting his work on the new trade agreement between Earth and the Vashtari Collective. The message mentioned an emergency session, but gave no details, unusual for the typically deliberate Concord. As he walked through the station's curved corridors, delegates from other species nodded respectfully. The Moravi representative, with her iridescent scales, bowed slightly. 2 Gellian diplomats, their 4 eyes blinking in sequence, made their species gesture of greeting. Daniel had spent years learning the customs of each Concord member, building relationships that had helped transform humanity from newcomers to respected allies. His deputy, Susan Miller, waited near the entrance to the Grand Chamber. Her normally composed face showed worry. "Daniel, something's wrong," she said quietly. The Thracian delegation arrived with military escorts, not just their usual honor guard. Daniel frowned. The Thracian Empire was the oldest power in the Concord, with territory spanning 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. Though technically at peace for 5 decades, tensions had been rising since Earth helped form the Alliance of Free Worlds, a coalition of smaller powers that served as a counterbalance to Thracian expansion. "Any hint what this is about?" Daniel asked. Susan shook her head. "No, but the Khaleesi ambassador looked scared when I saw him. And you know how hard it is to read Khaleesi emotions." Before Daniel could respond, the chamber doors opened. Inside, the horseshoe-shaped room hummed with tense voices. Representatives from all Concord species sat in tiered seats facing a central platform. On the platform stood a Thracian in elaborate gold and black robes, not their usual ambassador, but Emperor Kir of Xi himself. Daniel and Susan quickly took their seats in the human section. The chamber fell silent as the Emperor began to speak, his translator rendering his complex language into standard Concord speech. "Honored representatives," the Emperor's voice boomed. "With great regret, I must inform you that the Thracian Empire has taken military action against 3 worlds of the so-called Alliance of Free Worlds." Gasps and murmurs filled the chamber. Daniel felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Our intelligence has confirmed these worlds were developing quantum destabilization weapons in direct violation of Concord Treaty 5529. The Emperor continued. "We had no choice but to act decisively to protect galactic security." The Khaleesi ambassador stood, his tentacles trembling. "My world has no such weapons. Your warships destroy our orbital stations without warning." Thousands dead. Other Alliance representatives rose, voices overlapping in denial and outrage. Daniel sat motionless, mind racing. The Alliance had no quantum weapons program. He had personally helped draft their defense policies. This was fabricated, a pretext for something else. As evidence began playing on the chamber's holographic displays, Susan leaned close to his ear. "Those data patterns are forged," she whispered. "I recognize artifact signatures from our own security scans." Daniel finally understood. This wasn't just a military strike. It was a carefully planned diplomatic assault. The Thracians had studied humanity's rise in the Concord and were using their own methods against them. As smaller powers began voicing support for the Empire's actions, Daniel felt something cold form in his chest. Not fear, but rage, pure and clarifying. The peace he had spent 15 years building was shattering before his eyes, and he knew in that moment, that everything was about to change. The Concord chamber had turned into a battlefield of words. Daniel watched as Emperor Kirav Xi continued his address, the Thracian's six-fingered hands moving in practiced gestures that his species used to emphasize important points. "We have recovered design schematics, material requisitions, and test data," the Emperor said. "All evidence points to an advanced weapons program hidden across multiple Alliance worlds." The holographic displays showed complex diagrams and data streams that looked convincing to untrained eyes. Daniel noticed several neutral species representatives leaning forward, their body language showing they believed the Thracian claims. Susan touched Daniel's arm and whispered, "I need to check something." She slipped away while Daniel remained seated, his face carefully blank despite the anger building inside him. The Thracian delegation was large, 12 members flanking their emperor. Daniel recognized most of them from previous negotiations, but 3 were military officers he had never seen before. Their presence in a diplomatic setting was unusual and concerning. The Alliance representatives continued their denials, but their voices sounded increasingly desperate. The Khaleesi ambassador's translator could barely keep up with his agitated speech patterns as he described the destruction of his world's orbital habitats. "Regrettable casualties," the Emperor responded, his tone indicating anything but regret, "but necessary to prevent a greater catastrophe." The Alliance was developing weapons that could destabilize the quantum field of entire star systems. Daniel finally stood. The chamber quieted as he walked to the speaking platform. As Earth's representative, he carried significant influence. Humanity's rapid technological advancement and unique diplomatic approach had earned them respect despite their relatively recent arrival on the galactic stage. "Emperor Kirav," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. "The Alliance of Free Worlds has no such weapons program. Earth helped draft their defense protocols, and I personally reviewed their military research initiatives not 2 months ago." The Emperor's expression didn't change, but his inner eyelids flickered, a Thracian sign of smugness that most other species couldn't recognize. Daniel could, though. He had studied Thracian biology and culture extensively. "Perhaps, Ambassador Wright, you were not privy to the Alliance's more secretive endeavors," the Emperor suggested. Before Daniel could respond, a Thracian official projected new data. Communications logs supposedly showing Alliance scientists discussing weapon tests. Daniel recognized the formatting. It matched standard Earth encryption patterns. The chamber doors slid open as Susan returned. Her face was flushed from running. She hurried to Daniel's side and passed him a data tablet. "The evidence is fake," she whispered urgently. "They've planted false data throughout the Concord security network. I found original timestamps hidden in the code. These files were created less than 2 weeks ago." Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly. It confirmed his suspicions, but proving it to the Concord would be difficult. The Thracians had planned this well. Around the chamber, representatives from smaller neutral systems were already moving away from Alliance delegates, physically showing their political alignment shifting toward the Empire. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the Thracians knew it. The Concord Arbiter, a Moraxi whose species prided themselves on neutrality, called for a vote on whether to authorize Thracian pacification actions as a security measure. Daniel watched in dismay as the vote proceeded. One by one, neutral powers sided with the Empire. Even long-standing Alliance trade partners chose self-preservation over loyalty. "This is a mistake," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the chamber. "The Empire has presented no verifiable evidence. They seek only to destroy the counterbalance the Alliance provides." But his words changed nothing. The vote passed. As the chamber began to empty, Daniel stood alone on the platform. Susan approached, concern on her face. "They studied us," Daniel said quietly. "They learned our methods, building alliances, gathering evidence, swaying neutral parties. They're using our own diplomatic playbook." Susan nodded grimly. "What do we do now?" Daniel's eyes fixed on the retreating form of Emperor Kirav. The cold rage inside him was no longer just an emotion. It had become a plan taking shape. Now, he said, we show them they've only learned half of what humans are capable of. Earth's United Government Council chamber was filled with tension. 12 men and women sat around a circular table, their faces grim in the soft light. Screens on the walls showed burning cities on Alliance worlds and Thracian warships in formation. Daniel stood at the center, his diplomatic uniform replaced by simple civilian clothes. He had not slept in 36 hours. The reports are confirmed, said Defense Secretary Peter Johnson, a tall man with a military bearing. Thracian forces have occupied key facilities on 3 Alliance worlds. Resistance has been crushed. Their next targets appear to be the Proxima Centauri colonies. We should deploy the fleet immediately, said another council member. Show them humans won't stand idle while our allies are attacked. Olivia Garcia, the commerce director, shook her head. Our fleet is strong, but not strong enough to take on the full Thracian armada. We need economic sanctions, pressure from neutral systems. They won't work, Daniel interrupted. The Thracians have prepared for this. They've been studying us, learning our tactics. Whatever we do, they're expecting it. The room fell silent. President Linda Parker leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed on Daniel. You have something else in mind, Ambassador Wright. Daniel took a deep breath. Yes, we've been playing by their rules. Concord protocols, diplomatic traditions, cultural norms established by older species. It's time they learned ours. He activated a holographic display showing a complex network of connections between various systems. For 15 years, I've built relationships across the galaxy. Not just official diplomatic ties, but personal ones. I've identified factions within the Empire that disagree with the Emperor's policies. Species who have suffered pacification before. Intelligence assets placed in key locations. Daniel pointed to specific nodes in the display. We need to activate all of them. Not for a conventional diplomatic response or a direct military confrontation. Instead, we use what humans have always excelled at: asymmetrical tactics against a superior force. Admiral Samantha Wright, Daniel's sister and commander of Earth's Third Fleet, frowned from her seat at the table. What you're suggesting crosses the line between diplomacy and intelligence operations, possibly even covert warfare, she said. You're a diplomat, Daniel, not a spymaster. Daniel met his sister's gaze. Those lines were crossed when the Thracians attacked without provocation. They showed us the real rules of the game. He turned to face the entire council. Earth has technologies the Thracians don't fully understand. Our quantum communications network can't be intercepted by their monitoring systems. We have cultural understanding they lack. And most importantly, we have something they've never faced: human adaptability and determination. President Parker studied the display thoughtfully. What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador? A 3-pronged strategy, Daniel replied. First, expose Thracian deception to species that might still be persuaded. Second, establish contact with the Grey Council, Thracian nobles who oppose the Emperor's militarism. And third, gather true evidence of Thracian war crimes while helping Alliance worlds resist. Who would lead this operation? Asked Secretary Johnson. I would, Daniel said firmly, with a small team of specialists who understand both diplomacy and less conventional methods. A murmur ran through the council. An ambassador taking on such a role was unprecedented. The Thracians believe they understand humans now, Daniel continued. They've seen our diplomacy, our trade practices, our military doctrine. But they've never seen what happens when humans are truly backed into a corner. Admiral Wright leaned forward. This is dangerous, brother. If you're caught operating this kind of network, the Thracians will execute you as a spy, not detain you as a diplomat. Daniel nodded. I know the risks, but I spent 15 years building peace, and they destroyed it in a day. I won't let that stand. President Parker looked around the table, then back to Daniel. Very well, Ambassador Wright. Assemble your team. You have the full backing of Earth." Daniel's expression remained grim, but determination flashed in his eyes. "The Thracians think they've won the opening move," he said quietly. "They're about to learn this game has just begun." The moon of Proxima Centauri was an unlikely place for a command center. Its rough, rocky surface and thin atmosphere made it seem uninhabitable. Yet deep beneath its cratered exterior, Daniel and his team had established their base of operations. Daniel stood in the central room, surrounded by screens showing data from across the galaxy. His small team worked at various stations, their focus intense. "Jack, what's the status on the Khaleesi resistance?" Daniel asked. Jack Cooper looked up from his console. Before becoming a cultural attaché, Jack had served in Earth's Special Forces. His muscular frame and watchful eyes revealed his military background despite his civilian clothes. "They've received our supply drops," Jack replied. "The Thracians haven't found their mountain bases yet. The communication equipment we sent is helping them coordinate." Daniel nodded and turned to another team member. "Natalie, what about your models?" Dr. Natalie Kim was a game theorist who had spent years analyzing Thracian political dynamics. Her algorithms could predict how different factions would respond to various pressures. "The latest data confirms our approach is working," she said. "3 noble houses have privately contacted the Grey Council since we leaked the evidence of falsified weapons claims. The Emperor's support is weakening." Daniel moved to a large holographic display showing the Thracian Empire's territory. Red dots marked military outposts, while blue lines represented supply routes. "Alan, have you decoded their next targets?" Dr. Alan Foster, a xenolinguistics specialist who could break Thracian military ciphers, nodded. "They're planning strikes on these 4 systems next." He pointed to blinking areas on the map. "But they don't know we've warned the colonies there." Daniel studied the display. It had been 3 weeks since the initial Thracian attacks. Their Operation Broken Crown, named for their goal of undermining the Emperor's authority, was progressing faster than expected. The U.S. Defiant reports successful mission completion. Susan Miller announced from her station. She had joined Daniel's team, serving as his primary link to Earth's diplomatic corps. Daniel smiled slightly. The Defiant, equipped with experimental cloaking technology, had been gathering evidence of Thracian atrocities. Unlike the fabricated evidence the Thracians had presented, these recordings showed the true nature of their pacification efforts. "Send the data to our contacts in the neutral systems," Daniel instructed, "particularly the Moraxi and Vashtari representatives. They need to see what they've authorized with their votes." The team continued their work as Daniel stepped away to a quiet corner. He accessed a secured channel on his personal device, connecting to a shadowy figure whose features were deliberately obscured. "Counselor Venlar," Daniel greeted the Thracian noble. "Do you have news?" The figure spoke softly. "The Grey Council has seen your evidence. 7 houses now support motion against the Emperor, but we need more time." "Time is something the Alliance worlds don't have," Daniel replied. "The attacks continue." "Patience, Ambassador. Moving too quickly will alert the Emperor's loyalists." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Susan. "Daniel, Thracian forces have captured the human relief vessel Mercy. They're accusing it of carrying weapons to Alliance worlds." Daniel hurried back to the main room. "Status of the crew." Susan's face was pale. "Executed. All 23 of them. The Thracians are broadcasting it as a warning." The room fell silent. Daniel's hands gripped the edge of a console, his knuckles white. "They've crossed another line," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get me the personal files of every Thracian commander involved in this action." "What are you planning?" Jack asked. "The Thracians made this conflict abstract. Political moves on a galactic board. I'm going to make it personal." Daniel's eyes were cold. "Get me their names, their houses, their career histories, their family connections. Everything." Alan and Natalie exchanged glances. "And then?" Susan asked. Then we make sure everyone in human space knows exactly who murdered our people, Daniel said. And we make sure every Thracian noble house understands that humans don't forget, and we don't forgive. The rage that had driven Daniel since the Concord vote was no longer cold. It burned now, focused and precise, a weapon he intended to wield with devastating effect. Emperor Kira Xi paced in his private chambers aboard the Imperial flagship. His long, scaled fingers tapped nervously against his ceremonial armor. What had seemed like a simple military operation was becoming more complicated by the day. The human response is unexpected, said General Drav, the Emperor's military advisor. The Emperor turned sharply. Explain. They aren't fighting us directly, Drav said. Instead, they're targeting our supply lines, disrupting communications and spreading unrest across our subject worlds. A third Thracian, wearing the green robes of the intelligence service, stepped forward with a data display. 3 days ago, detailed personal information about the commanders who executed the human relief ship crew was released across all communication channels. Now the families of those commanders are receiving threats from within our own territory. The Emperor hissed in frustration. How? Our communication networks are secure. The humans have technology we don't fully understand, the intelligence officer admitted. And they've been building networks of allies for years, not just official channels, but personal connections across species. Far from the Imperial flagship, Admiral Eric Martinez watched from the bridge of the Earth warship Valiant as his small fleet executed another precision strike. Unlike the massive Thracian warships designed for overwhelming force, human vessels were built for speed and adaptability. Target their fuel processors only, Martinez ordered. Minimum casualties, maximum economic damage. The Valiant's weapons officer nodded. Firing solutions ready, sir. Beams of energy lanced out from the human ships, striking the Thracian supply base with surgical precision. Storage tanks erupted in flames, but the living quarters remained untouched. Confirm no civilian casualties, Martinez demanded. Sensors show the living areas are intact, sir. Their workers are evacuating safely. Martinez nodded with satisfaction. Good. Now we disappear before the response fleet arrives. The human vessels vanished into faster-than-light travel just as Thracian warships appeared at the edge of the system. Meanwhile, in the Galactic Concord chambers, Daniel stood before the representatives once again. But the mood was different now. 2 months of carefully executed operations had changed the political landscape. Honored representatives, Daniel began, I come before you with evidence that cannot be dismissed. He activated a holographic display showing documented Thracian war crimes, alongside proof that the original weapons allegations had been fabricated. The Empire claimed they acted to prevent a threat, Daniel continued. The truth is they sought to destroy the only alliance strong enough to challenge their expansion. Around the chamber, representatives from formerly neutral systems whispered among themselves. 3 subject worlds of the Empire had sent unofficial delegates who stood in the observer section, their presence a silent protest against their Thracian rulers. The Thracian representative rose, his posture aggressive. These accusations are manufactured by humans seeking to justify their interference in imperial matters. Daniel remained calm. Unlike the evidence your emperor presented, every piece of our documentation has been verified by independent sources. The timestamps, transmission codes, and authentication signatures are available for any member to examine. Susan, standing beside Daniel, watched the chamber's mood shifting. Their weeks of work exposing Thracian deceptions was bearing fruit. The Thracian representative, growing desperate, approached Daniel directly. Your species is too young to understand galactic politics, he hissed quietly, meant for Daniel's ears only. You'll regret challenging the Empire. Daniel didn't flinch. The Thracians' threat, picked up by hidden microphones, was broadcast throughout the chamber. Several representatives gasped at the naked hostility. We didn't start this conflict, Daniel replied, his voice steady and clear for all to hear. But make no mistake, we know exactly how to end it. The Concord Arbiter called for a new vote. this time on whether to demand Thracian withdrawal from Alliance worlds. Daniel and Susan watched as, one by one, systems that had previously sided with the Empire changed their positions. As the session ended, Susan turned to Daniel. "This is a diplomatic victory, but the Emperor won't accept the Concord's decision easily." Daniel nodded. "I know. That's why the next phase of our plan doesn't rely on diplomacy alone." His communication device signaled an incoming message from Earth. President Parker's face appeared on the small screen. "The Grey Council has made contact directly," she said. "They're ready to move against the Emperor." The Thracian flagship hung in space above the contested Alliance world of Colossi Prime. Its massive form dwarfed the smaller ships around it, a physical representation of the Empire's power. Inside the ornate command center, Emperor Kira Xi sat on his mobile throne, surrounded by military advisors and noble representatives. "The situation has become problematic," said Lord Venthak, a senior member of the Emperor's Council. "The Concord vote demands our withdrawal. 3 of our subject worlds have requested verification of the original weapons claims, and our supply lines continue to suffer attacks." The Emperor's inner eyelids flickered with irritation. "The humans have been more troublesome than anticipated. Perhaps it is time to consider a diplomatic solution," suggested another advisor carefully. "Yes," the Emperor said after a long pause. "Prepare a ceasefire offer." Daniel received news of the Thracian ceasefire proposal while meeting with his team on Proxima Centauri. The terms appeared reasonable at first glance: withdrawal from one Alliance world, reduced presence on the others, and a commitment to further discussion of disputed territories. "It's a trap," Natalie Kim said immediately. "My models show they're trying to split the Alliance. These terms benefit the larger Alliance members while abandoning the smaller ones." Jack Cooper nodded in agreement. "Meanwhile, their intelligence services would have time to locate and eliminate resistance movements." "And find our base," added Alan Foster. Daniel studied the proposal carefully. "You're right. They're not seeking peace. They're trying to buy time and divide our allies." Susan looked troubled. "But if we reject it outright, we'll appear unreasonable to neutral systems." "We won't reject it," Daniel said. "We'll appear to consider it seriously." He turned to his communication station. "Contact Admiral Martinez. Tell him to maintain current operations but prepare for Phase 2, and get me a secure line to the Grey Council." 3 days later, Daniel stood before the Concord representatives, seemingly ready to discuss the Emperor's proposal. The Thracian delegation watched with satisfaction as Daniel spoke of considering all peaceful options and the value of diplomatic solutions. What they didn't know was that human intelligence had discovered the Emperor's true plan: a surprise attack on Proxima Centauri, while peace talks distracted Earth's leadership. As Daniel continued his measured speech, Thracian warships emerged from faster-than-light travel near Proxima Centauri, their weapons charged, ready to destroy the human colony and the secret base. But the system wasn't defenseless. Hidden Earth vessels, supported by Alliance ships, dropped their cloaking shields and opened fire. The Thracian attack force, expecting an easy victory, found themselves caught in a carefully planned ambush. In the Concord chamber, Daniel's communication device vibrated. He glanced at it briefly, then looked up at the Thracian delegates with a cold smile. "I've just received word that your Emperor's forces have attacked Proxima Centauri," he announced to the shock chamber. "While offering peace with one hand, he strikes with the other." The Thracian delegates' expressions confirmed their guilt. They hadn't expected Daniel to know about the attack so quickly. "This action violates the most sacred principle of the Concord, that peace negotiations must be conducted in good faith," Daniel continued. "It is an offense that has only one historical precedent, and that resulted in the responsible government's exclusion from the Concord." Murmurs spread through the chamber as representatives recalled the ancient case he referenced. The Thracian delegates looked increasingly uncomfortable. Across Thracian space, carefully cultivated resistance movements began simultaneous disruptions of military operations. Communication hubs failed. Supply depots reported mysterious shortages. Security systems on key facilities suddenly went offline, and within the Emperor's inner circle, the Grey Council made its move. 7 noble houses simultaneously announced their withdrawal of support for the war effort, citing evidence of the Emperor's deception. Back on Earth, President Linda Parker addressed an emergency Concord session via holographic projection. The Thracian Empire must withdraw from all Alliance worlds within 30 planetary rotations, she declared. Failure to comply will result in the full united response of humanity and its allies, not just military, but economic, political, and social isolation of the imperial government. Her words carried weight that would have been unimaginable months earlier. The human-led alliance, once dismissed by the Emperor as insignificant, had transformed into the decisive power in galactic politics. Thracian warships slowly withdrew from Alliance space, their once proud formations now scattered and disorganized. After 3 days of internal conflict, the imperial palace had fallen. Emperor Kira of Xi no longer ruled. In his place, a provisional council led by members of the Grey Council took control of the government. Daniel watched the reports from the observation deck of the rebuilt Concord station. 6 months had passed since the Thracian attacks began. The view before him was very different now. Representatives of formerly enemy species worked together, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Hard to believe how much has changed, Susan said, joining him at the viewport. Daniel nodded. When this started, I was just trying to save the Alliance. I never expected to reshape the entire galactic order. In the weeks following President Parker's ultimatum, the Thracian Empire had crumbled from within. Daniel's careful cultivation of the Grey Council and other resistance elements had paid off. Rather than face total isolation and internal rebellion, the Emperor had been forced to step down. The provisional government has agreed to all our terms, Susan said, checking her data tablet. War reparations, independent monitoring of their military, and representation for formerly subject worlds. And most importantly, a complete restructuring of the Concord itself, Daniel added. That had been his ultimate goal, not just defeating the Thracians, but transforming the Concord from a forum dominated by ancient powers into a truly representative body, where all species had an equal voice. Jack Cooper approached, looking strange in formal diplomatic attire instead of his usual practical clothing. The Khaleesi ambassador wants to thank you personally, he said to Daniel. Their world is nearly rebuilt. Daniel smiled slightly. Tell him I'll meet with him this afternoon. As Jack left, Daniel turned back to the view. Ships from 17 different species moved through space around the station, working together on reconstruction efforts. The Alliance had not only survived but grown stronger, welcoming former Thracian subject worlds, seeking protection from future aggression. You know, your sister says you've created a power vacuum, Susan mentioned. Admiral Wright is concerned about who might try to fill it. That's why our work isn't finished, Daniel replied. Power shouldn't be concentrated in any single species or alliance. The new Concord Charter ensures decisions require broad consensus. Through the viewport, Daniel watched a small Thracian diplomatic vessel dock at the station. From it emerged a young Thracian in simple green robes, very different from the elaborate attire Thracian officials once wore. That's Venzar, isn't it? Susan asked, the junior member of the Provisional Council. Daniel nodded. He requested a meeting. Says he wants to learn from humans about building lasting peace rather than enforcing temporary compliance. And you agreed. Susan sounded surprised. After everything the Thracians did, peace isn't just about defeating enemies, Daniel said quietly. It's about transforming them into partners. He turned from the viewport, his expression thoughtful. When the Thracians first attacked, I felt a fury I hadn't experienced in years. I wanted them to pay for what they'd done. They have paid, Susan pointed out. Yes, but revenge wasn't the goal. Justice was. And justice requires building something better, not just tearing down what was wrong. As they walked toward the meeting chambers, representatives from various species nodded respectfully to Daniel. His reputation had spread across the galaxy, not just as the diplomat whose fury had brought down an empire, but as the architect of a new galactic order. The young Thracian waited nervously in the small meeting room. He stood as Daniel entered. "Ambassador Wright," he said with a formal bow. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Daniel gestured for him to sit. "I understand you're interested in human diplomatic approaches." "Yes," Venzar replied. "My people have much to learn about building relationships rather than demanding obedience." Daniel studied the young Thracian. In his eyes, Daniel saw something rare, a genuine desire to change, to learn, to grow beyond centuries of imperial thinking. "Then let's begin," Daniel said, the last traces of his anger fading into something more constructive. "Hope for a truly lasting peace."